From a leadership perspective, for the DrPH, you are specifically there to be a leader. You're learning how to be a practitioner. You're learning how to do grant writing. You're learning how to manage a budget. You're learning about all of the different intricacies of a public health or running a public health agency. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Marissa Robinson, current Vice President for the DrPH Coalition, and you're listening to the Public Health Insight Podcast.
You're listening to the Public Health Insight Podcast, your go-to space for all things public health and global health, from the Sustainable Development Goals to the social determinants of health, as well as interesting dialogues about the diverse career opportunities that exist in these fields. Remember to subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts and Spotify so other people like you can benefit from our content.
Before we move on, it is important to note that the views expressed in this podcast are our own and do not necessarily represent any of the agencies or organizations we work for or are affiliated with.
So let's talk about that for a second. So why is there this historical kind of gap of knowledge about the DrPH program? Like, why is it that it is PhDs or MDs and the DrPH degree has less of a spotlight shone on it?
I mean, it's actually kind of crazy when you think about it because, I mean, obviously a PhD is a very old degree, MD is a very old degree, but the DrPH is over 100 years old. And the first one was at Harvard in like 1911. So this isn't new. This isn't something people made up like 20 years ago and we've just started doing. It's been around for a really long time. And I think there's a couple things that like work against it in a way. I think the PhD's just been around for such a longer time that it tends to steal the show in people's minds when they think about a doctoral degree. And I don't know how many times I've said DrPH to people and they still are like, oh, how's your PhD going? And I'm like, that's not what I'm doing, but okay, sure. At some point, or just sort of like resigned to it. But always trying to advocate, obviously. But at some point, you have to just be like, okay, yeah. And so, but I think the other thing is that it's so multifaceted. It's like when you think PhD, you think research, right? When you think DrPH, you can think tons of things, right? Epidemiology, research, leadership, equity, health economics, policy. Like there are tons of things. Everyone's experience and everyone's expertise is probably going to be different at the end when they come out of their program. And so I think it's just harder for people to nail down. At least that's my thoughts. Marissa, what about you?
Yeah, and I think traditionally when you have positions like a chief medical officer or a health director or a public health analyst or a public health practitioner, you're thinking of a researcher or you're thinking of medicine, because those are traditionally the two avenues that have been put in place for you to achieve leadership roles or for you to make those changes from a policy perspective. Because when you have folks that come and speak to Congress or speak to congressional leaders or policy leaders, they usually have those disciplines behind their names to be able to say, hey, this is the research we have, here is the data, and this is why you need to implicate X, Y, and Z. But they are missing a key point of the DrPH, because the DrPH can bring not only what Lauren just said of policy, medicine, as well as the science, but can talk about the different public health infrastructures that might be lacking, or talking about the systematic issues that are causing these disparities. And from a public health perspective and lens, that's a specific niche that not everybody is going to get in med school, that they're not going to get at a PhD program. So, and I do see that a lot of our leaders that are coming in this last 5 to 10 years, a lot of them do have a master's of public health, which is definitely a step in the right direction, right? Because we want our leaders to have the discipline of public health and some of those epidemiology and some of the statistical analyses and backing of biostatistics, of knowing, do I need to do a statistical analysis or do I need to come from this from a qualitative standpoint to really get and understand the how and the why something is happening. And so the public health practitioners can bring that to the forefront. And traditionally, I think from a larger standpoint, the DrPH is something that not a lot of people have pursued. And so there are folks that have a DrPH, but not a lot of them are in the DrPH Coalition. So one, we are always looking for new members, and we are always encouraging folks that are pursuing a terminal degree in public health to consider the DrPH, because the PhD route or the MD route is not the only way that you can get a DrPH. But thinking about all of the different ways that you can make a difference, you can do that without a DrPH. But if you are pursuing the DrPH, we want to hear from you, and we want to make sure that the coalition is a space where it's not just an old boys club, if you will. Like, we're always trying to think of our members and try to think of new ways to be engaging, innovative, and making sure that the voices of those that aren't always heard are also a part of the conversation and at the table. And I think from a public health perspective, that is what the field of public health has always tried to do. But a lot of times public health funding is the first one to get cut. Medical funding, usually always there. Science funding for research, data, all of that's always usually there. But public health, when it's helping folks and breaking down systemic barriers, that's usually the funding that always gets cut.
Yeah, and I would say, so LaShawn and I, a few weeks ago, maybe months ago, we actually came across an article, let me pull it up here, where it says, "Want to fix public health? Stop thinking like a doctor." Not sure if either of you had a chance to read it, but it was very, right, it was a very interesting title, and it was a very interesting arguments that they brought forth, much like what you're doing now. Now, if it's clear that there are differences, and you've both made that clear in the outcome and why someone might need one versus the other. But the program itself, could you share some of what things you would consider similar with the thesis, dissertation type thing, and maybe where does the two degrees start to diverge a little bit?
Sure. Lauren, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can go first. And I'm going to say up front, I think the good thing and sometimes the bad thing about this is that you're going to probably hear different things from me and Marissa about our programs, because the programs do things a little different sometimes. So the PhD, in my brain, the similarities, you do have to do a dissertation. For some reason in my program, and I don't know if this is a CEEF thing or if it's like just me, but they call it an integrated learning experience, which I don't really know why they call it that, but it's a dissertation. We have to write a big paper. And they encourage it to be more practice-based. So like I don't have to do my own research in the traditional sense. Like I don't have to, if I don't want to, I don't have to go out and gather my own data and like do all that stuff. I will be, but I don't have to. I could have used secondary sources. And they also want it to be more practice-based in the real world, which obviously can have its issues. So that's, I think besides that, that's probably one of the biggest things. I think another like big tenet of the PhD is like having that faculty mentor. And I think this is also program specific. Some programs like probably do match you at the beginning. I know for my program, they gave us a faculty mentor that just gave you advice and just said, hey, how you doing? What's going on? It didn't mean that person was going to be your dissertation chair. It didn't mean that person was going to help you do your dissertation or anything like that. That person was really just to be a source of support and a resource. Mai ended up being, and she is now my dissertation chair because we just found a really great relationship. But that wasn't, I don't think, the thought, and that's unheard of in a PhD. You're matched at the beginning and you're with that person the entire time. You're helping them with their research, you're doing that kind of stuff. So it's a different thing. The DrPH for my program, it's 3 years if you go full time. It's 4 years if you go part time. So the first 2 years are classes, which I think is pretty similar to a PhD. And then the last year is your dissertation. And you do have to do an internship, which I don't think PhDs do. So from us, it was 300 hours, which when you're working full time, going to school full time, and then they tack on the fun little internship, can be a little bit of a crazy semester or two, but is really great for getting some of that hands-on experience. So they can be a little bit shorter. I mean, PhDs, you're talking 4 to 6 plus years. So it can be a little bit longer of a commitment. I think another thing to really consider, and we can get into this more, is the funding. Because PhD, for the most part, they're going to be funded. A DrPH is probably not going to be funded. There's very few programs that have funding in place the way a PhD does. You can find scholarships, you can find things like that to help. We'll talk about this when we get down to talking more about the programs, but some of them are more cost effective than others. And so that's something to keep in mind when you're looking at programs. Marissa?
Yeah, so I'd like to start with some of the differences. Obviously, with a DrPH, you can work full time. With a PhD, you cannot at all. Period. You are there for school. You are there to be in the lab and provide whatever research experience that you can. With a PhD, you also have to do something called a postdoc, which is right after you graduate, you then have basically like a fellowship kind of experience where you're like a trainee or you're a fellow in or a postdoc in somebody's either public health, school of medicine, if you're going into academia. And most PhD programs that have a postdoc are going into academia, so you would start to teach classes. Usually when you are also a PhD student, you are a TA of some sort for the master's students or students that are in undergrad. So that is a completely different experience for the DrPH. For the DrPH, you are either working, mostly folks are working full-time, so you are either doing both full-time, which I did, my DrPH full-time and working full-time because I'm insane and that's not the norm. But there are a lot of folks that are doing their DrPH program part-time and are working full-time. And you got to think of, for PhDs, most of those folks are coming straight out of undergrad. So they're coming either from a master's program or they're coming from undergrad. And so they are going for 4 to up to 7 years to do this PhD program. So they have never had any, for the most part, traditionally they have never had any work experience. Whereas for a DrPH, you have to have some sort of work experience in order to get into the program itself. Then when we're talking about curriculum, most DrPH programs can be online and hybrid. You have some programs that do require you to be in person. Sometimes, like for Lauren and others, they might not have to go on campus at all, but you have some programs where they will require you to come at least once for a week in the summer and then in the fall or like the winter for like an institute. So you get to be with professors, you get to be with your cohort members. And for a PhD program, the cohort is a little bit bigger than for a DrPH program. A DrPH program cohort might be 3 or 4 or up to 7. For a PhD, you could have, 7 to 12 individuals. So it's a little bit bigger in terms of your cohort members that are also happening to be in the program with you. And then from a leadership perspective, for the DrPH, you are specifically there to be a leader. You're learning how to be a practitioner. You're learning how to do grant writing. You're learning how to manage a budget. You're learning about all of the different intricacies of a public health or running a public health agency. And you don't necessarily have to do a quote unquote postdoc or a post DrPH experience. You have something called the practicum. So you are working full time during this experience. So you need to be doing something other than your job for that 3-month period to learn how to do project management or develop a grant or help manage a budget and do some of those big pieces that are key in public health. And lastly, for the differences, I think from the DrPH perspective, a lot of folks that are pursuing the degree are mid-career folks. So they are folks who have had a master's in public health, have had 5 to 10 to 15 years of experience, and are like, you know what, I want to be in leadership, because from a leadership perspective, some leadership positions that like to be an executive director or to be a director of public health or a chief medical officer or a CEO or whatever, you have to have that terminal degree. And so some of those requirements require you to have a doctorate of some sort, whether it's a medical doctorate, a medicine degree, I don't know what I just said, a PhD or a DrPH to get into those positions. A lot of DrPHers are pursuing those positions of leadership, so they want to get the DrPH. And they've experienced what I said in my sentiments earlier of those glass ceilings and those barriers. So I think that's a lot of the reason why people also pursue the DrPH, whereas a PhD, people are pursuing the PhD because they need funding, they need research dollars, they want to be in academia, or they want to be in a research type field. So those are some of those differences there. In terms of my program, at Morgan, when I first started, they had different tracks that you could be on. You could be on the epidemiology track. You could be on the health policy and management track. You can be on the environmental health track. You can be on the social and behavior scientist track. And then as I was going through the program, they did away with the tracks because from ASPPH, or the Association of Schools of Public Health, they have certain requirements and credentials that you have to get in order to get your degrees. So you have to have certain competencies and able to say, I am a expert in public health, or I am a subject matter expert in epidemiology or biostats or health policy or whatever. And so what Lauren just talked about in her candidacy is in the DrPH, you have to have a candidacy exam or a competency exam to make sure. Listen. But it's okay because there are study guides. There are study guides out there, and
You're not alone.
You're not alone. And a lot of times, if you only focus on what the study guide says, you will be fine. Okay. And really, there's nothing that they're going to throw at you that you have not heard before, especially if you have a master's in public health. And if you're a certified public health practitioner, or if you have your CEF, or if you have your master CEF, all of those questions are very similar to what you're going to get on a competency exam. So all of it is very similar. And so for my program, it was 4 years for me. I did my program pretty fast. I did it full time as I was working. And I also took classes over the summer, whereas you didn't have to do that. You could have did it in the fall. And so I was on a somewhat of an accelerated track for myself. So, but you can get your DrPH within 3 years, but you can go up to 10, depending on if you're working full time and you're only doing part time. Some of these individuals are parents, right? They have whole families and kids that they're trying to raise and work full time and run a nonprofit. And the degree of public health is all about getting a bag, okay? We are getting bagged kind of people, and we are entrepreneurial spirits, and so we will find ways to get money on the side. But anyway, in my program, we had to do a practicum, like Lauren said. You do your first 2 years of classes, then you do your candidacy exams, then you go into pre-candidacy, talking about your dissertation, and then you do your final defense of your dissertation, and then you go to graduation. And for me, it was a very traditional, you had to do a dissertation. There was no, you could just do manuscripts, or you could just do a applied kind of interdisciplinary experience. But every program for the DrPH is different. And that is one of the beautiful things about the DrPH, because most PhDs, you can't really veer from the PhD curriculum. It is what it is. You're going to get what you're going to get no matter if you in the U.S. or if you abroad. But for the DrPH, you could have a program like Lawrence that's an integrative learning experience. You could also have a DrPH program that makes you do a dissertation. Or you could have a program that's like, hey, you just need to publish 3 manuscripts and you can get out of here. So it really depends on your school and what experiences you're bringing to the table, but also what are you looking for in the experience. Gordon, don't be discouraged, because there is a program for you, and we're going to find you one, because we are not leaving this podcast without you committing to getting your DrPH. I'm just playing.
So
but not really.
Let's keep the pressure on that for a second. Lauren, if someone's interested in pursuing a DrPH program, what are some of those requirements they need to tick off in order to apply? Like, is there a statement of interest, minimum GPA?
Yeah, it's definitely at least, it depends on the program, 3 to 5 years of work experience. A lot of programs are eliminating the GRE requirement. So, Gordon, that you would not have to probably do. A lot of people are deciding that's not a requirement anymore. GPA, I found that they care a lot more about your master's GPA, thank God, than they do about your undergrad GPA, because I definitely did not graduate my undergrad with the best. So they're very holistic, which I think is wonderful, because they look at they look at your academic performance, but they look at your work experience. And if you, in your personal statement, emphasis on the personal, really connect to what you're doing now and how this degree will take you to the next level, I think you will be successful in applying, for sure.
Yep.
Okay.
And can I add that they also have different requirements for different programs. So like for my DrPH, I had to do an interview once I got accepted into the program, just to establish, like, okay, are you who you say you are? Are you like just finessing this program? Like, are you really a subject matter expert in a certain way? So some programs also do a interview component. And, you know, with COVID, we've done a lot of virtual things as well. So for some, it might be a virtual interview, but for some, it also is an in-person experience. So it really depends on the program. And like if you're global, then obviously it would be virtual. But if you are stateside, you would probably be expected to come in person to conduct your interview. So that's another thing to definitely think about when you're talking about this whole person perspective. And if you don't have 3 to 5 years experience, that's not to say like they won't accept you, but I would really emphasize that you really need to be passionate about this degree in order to pursue it. So don't just tick it off to check a box to say, oh, I want to get doctor in front of my name just to say that you're a doctor. But you really want to be a subject matter expert. You want to be passionate about a certain area of research or a certain gap in the literature of health disparity or a disadvantaged or marginalized population in order to pursue this.
Thank you for listening to the Public Health Insight Podcast, your go-to space for informative conversations, inspiring community action. If you enjoy our podcast, be sure to subscribe and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. See you in the next one.